Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the annual Augustine Henry Forestry Lecture. And this year's subject is agroforestry, trees on farms and carbon neutral livestock systems. And we are delighted that Jim McAdam is going to present this talk. The event is organised by the Society of Irish Foresters and facilitated by Teresa O'Brien of the Irish Bioenergy Association. I would like to thank Teresa for her work, and also to Pat O'Sullivan, Technical Director of the Society of Irish Foresters, for organising this event. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Society of Irish Foresters, it was founded in 1942, and it represents the interests of more than 700 members, representing a wide cross-section of people involved in forestry. But its main objective is to represent the forestry profession and ensure that the highest standards are achieved. During today's talk, you can feed questions into the Q&A box, and we'll pick those up during Jim's talk, and I will ask Jim the relevant questions at the end of his talk. But before we proceed further, I'd like to say a few words about Augustine Henry. Augustine Henry was the son of an Irish father and Scottish mother. He was born on the 2nd of July, 1857 in Dundee, but in Scotland. But shortly after his birth, the family moved to Cookstown, County Tyrone. And following an illustrious education career in Queen's Colleges, Belfast and Galway, which is now NUI Galway, he sat his medical exams in Edinburgh University in 1880 to allow him to work as a medical officer in the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs Service at Shanghai, eventually ended up in Yishang in central China. Here he began to collect plants, exploring the remote interior Chinese landscape. By the time he left China for Ireland in 1900, he had collected 158,000 dried specimens, representing more than 6,000 different species, including 1,726 new plant discoveries. He then trained as a forester in Nancy in France shortly after he returned. But then a fortuitous meeting with Henry John Elwes, a wealthy landlord in the Cheltenham area, as we're just removed from that this week. And the two of them got together to produce 7 volumes of the Trees of Great Britain and Ireland. So this pioneering work began in 1903 when Elwes and Henry decided that they would locate, measure, photograph and illustrate tree species around the world that had potential as forests or parkland trees, both in Ireland and Britain. Researching the publication was a huge task as they travelled throughout Europe, the Americas, part of Asia, Australia, at a time when it was quite difficult to arrange basically sea transport, and when they got to countries they used train and cars. Matter of fact, both of them weren't excellent drivers. I think they wrecked one car and wore out another one during the first period of this. But finally, after 10 years, they completed volume 8, followed by an index, which is a volume in its own right. And this work, the Trees of Great Britain and Ireland, is really regarded as a monumental achievement for its time and still stands up. I'd like to say as well that the Society produced a facsimile edition of it, which I was proud to be involved in a few years ago, and it's available. If you get in touch with the Society, check out its website, it's still available. The Society has long appreciated Henry's work as a forester, botanist and plant collector. And around about, I think in 1951, the Society erected a memorial stone for Augustine Henry in Avondale. And it has the simple message at the bottom: he enriched our knowledge of trees, which indeed, of course, he did. The Augustine Henry Lecture has addressed a wide range of topical topics in his time. And today's subject is topical because it addresses agroforestry, trees on farms and carbon neutral livestock systems. Like farming, like other industries, and probably more so than other industries in Ireland, it faces major challenges in decarbonising the economy. The Augustine Henry Lecture has addressed, as I said, topics around this area of climate change, but today's subject should really fall into historical, because agroforestry has been around for centuries in some form or another, and it has been widely adopted on the continent, but has been very, very slow to get off in Ireland. Today's presentation by Jim McAdam, Honorary Professor, Queen's University, Belfast, and Chair of the Agricultural History Society of Ireland, is important in this regard. Jim himself started the agroforestry research program at AFBI, that's the Agri-Food and Bioscience Institute, at the research station in Loughgall, County Armagh, back in 1989. He was head of the Grassland and Plant Science branch of AFBI until his retirement less than 3 years ago. As I said in the beginning, he's honorary professor at Queen's University, Belfast. He's also past chairman of the Farm Woodland Forum and has participated in several national and EU agroforestry-based programs. So he's ideally positioned to talk about this subject. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Jim McAdam to talk today on agroforestry, trees on farms and carbon neutral livestock systems.
Thank you very much indeed, Donald, for that introduction, and it's a great honour and privilege for me to address the Society and to deliver this annual Augustine Henry Forestry Lecture. I'm not a forester by background, so that makes it even more a privilege, if you like, and I hope you tolerate me on that. I came to agroforestry more as an agronomist, just trying to sell and improve grassland systems, and that will maybe become obvious as we go through the talk. Whenever I was asked about this, to do the talk, which was a privilege, of course, I looked up a bit about Augustine Henry, and just by coincidence, whenever I retired 2 years ago from 40 years in the civil service in Queen's University in Northern Ireland, whenever my staff were having, I suppose, a customary whip around, someone had asked me what we like, and I think my wife said, well, he's got plenty of books anyway. But no matter, I was hugely surprised and deeply moved at my presentation when I left, when I was presented with the aforementioned by Donald set of the volume of the set of volumes of the trees of Great Britain and Ireland. So, you know, that whenever I was asked to do this lecture, that was even more an honour. But I have those on my shelves, and they are really a magnificent set of facsimile reprints, and I'm delighted to have them. I also had another connection with Augustine. Whenever I went back and looked at him a bit more, I live actually in Cookstown. And as Donald said, that's where Augustine spent his youth after his parents came back from Scotland. And he was educated at Cookstown Academy, which is this building here, which no longer stands. But so that is an interesting connection. And of course, he went to Queen's University, which I did both my primary and my doctorate through. So I do feel I have some connections in the past, and certainly I haven't had travels in China like him, done some travels in South America where there are many fine plant collections have been made. But you know, we're following really in a tradition, certainly of a great man, a man who's had a huge influence on Irish forestry. But what I really want to talk about today, I suppose, is to really look at the role of forestry, look at the role of trees, perhaps in a slightly different context, and a context which was maybe driven on us by circumstances, but which I have really been working on for about the last 30 years. I think since 1989, I started the agroforestry program in Northern Ireland. And as we go through the talk, we'll see some evidence, a lot of evidence produced from that program. But just to set the scene, I want to start off by talking about just really the obvious, which a lot of you are aware of course, but it sets the scene of the role I see for agroforestry, or one role anyway. That is, just look at the problems facing livestock agriculture as we come to a more climate challenge scenario. Then just look a little bit, what do we mean by agroforestry in the widest context? And then what do I think anyway, and I hope to convince my audience that some of our problems can be helped. Agroforestry can offer a solution to some of those problems, or an option that will help address those problems. And then really finish up with I suppose the thorny question of how might we deliver that. You know, we've got a very stable and vital livestock agriculture industry in this island, and whenever you try to introduce another concept within that, it puts up challenges, and that's really what I want to talk about that as we go through. Well, if we think just about the problems that are facing farming, and from a sustainability perspective, Irish agriculture faces challenges really in a whole range of key areas, most of them caused by most of them caused by the intensification that really has happened post Second World War and really post our entry into the Economic Union, into the European Union, EEC as it was in the 1970s. Issues of water quality, issues of loss of biodiversity on farmland, and of course greenhouse gas emissions. Looking at the wider land use context too, we have an issue with tree cover, and we have virtually one of the lowest tree covers in Europe, and we have issues meeting our planting targets. We have issues of air quality through our livestock intensification, and we have issues of soil health and degradation, and those all lead to the bigger issues around farming itself, how farming can help reduce climate change mitigation within the obligations that we have, and to ensure most of all that we maintain a viable rural community. The family farm is the core really of rural life in Ireland, and we really want to ensure that no matter what structure we come up with, no matter how we go ahead to meet the climate change challenges we have. And farming is part of the solution. People may say, oh, farming is the problem, but farming is also the solution. So what's the sort of context that I'm coming to this and to try and see how we can make agriculture more sustainable? Just the fairly obvious that the figures most of you know, that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by sector, most other sectors are dealing with greenhouse gas emissions, whereas agriculture remains stubbornly high. And largely because we have a large and expanding livestock industry, which, even though it has expanded and it has absorbed a lot of those emissions as it's gone, but it still remains high because of just the growth and vigorous growth there's been in effective agriculture. One of our other serious issues we have is the issue of ammonia, an air pollutant, if you like, not a greenhouse gas, but an air pollutant. And if we look just for the Northern Ireland figures of, we look at how we're managing to deal with reduction in almost all air pollutants we have, apart from ammonia. And ammonia, of course, the bulk of our ammonia problem is coming from agriculture, coming from livestock. So those are the sort of challenges that we set ourselves in trying to come up with a more sustainable agriculture system. We also must recognize too that livestock production is important, given our climate, given our soils. Most of the UK farmland is really best suited for growing grass for animals to eat, and that supplies over the whole of the British Isles really. And grazing livestock on this land enables us to turn a product, an edible human product, grass, into nutrient-rich food, which is suitable to feed us and a much bigger population of people worldwide. But of course, we know that livestock production has an unfairly bad press from some other from some sectors, and it's under great challenge is to meet their climate change obligations. So set against that, how can we look at making livestock production more carbon neutral? Well, there are two sort of key strategies we can adopt to meet this challenge. One of the first, which I won't be talking about today, really is a separate issue, but is to increase our dependence on grass or homegrown forage. In other words, we import a large amount of feed to produce the milk and meat that we deliver, and of course that adds significantly to our carbon footprint. If we could depend much more on grass or a better balance between homegrown forage to feed those animals, then that would go away towards dressing our livestock systems. The other way, of course, which I'm going to talk about particularly this afternoon, is we could absorb more carbon on our farms to reduce our net emissions and hence enhance biodiversity and water quality, i.e. integrate more trees into our farming system, and trees are what we're here to talk about. We have to realize too, we need to get more credit for the amount of carbon that is stored on our farms and the amount of carbon that is being sequestered. And that's one of the roles we can see with the trees within our farming systems. So we really want to just change our land use patterns from something like this, and this is just and Uptake from the National Trust, to a landscape, a farmed landscape, which is producing food, but is much more diverse in the way it produces that food. In other words, it's not just into food production, but it's producing a whole suite of public goods, carbon, water, food, access to the countryside, all biodiversity, landscape, all those things that we want to deliver from the farmed landscape. That's our challenge. And if you look at the difference really between the top and bottom, the two pictures, the one big difference is there are lots of trees in the bottom system. And that's really, when we come to think, that's why I'm just using that to introduce the concept of agroforestry, of trying to get more trees into this farming landscape, not just directly as a result of substituting agriculture land for straight forestry land. We're looking at another option, if you like, a median house that can be adaptable and usable in some scenarios. We know we have an issue with tree cover, and that we are down there. Ireland is down near the bottom, and the UK just above it. We're down below, we're 11, 12%. In Northern Ireland's even lower than that. We're probably about 8% is our figure for tree cover. So we really are just right at the bottom of the league table of tree cover in Europe. So that's a further challenge. We want to try and get more trees into our landscape, because we all know, we appreciate the benefits that trees bring, and really the need we have for trees to address some of our net zero carbon targets that we have. So agriculture, or agroforestry, sorry, is just one potential tool in that armory we have to try and address these issues of a more sustainable livestock production system. Agroforestry, I use, there are many definitions of it, but really the key words in that definition are, it's a collective name for land use practice where trees are combined with crops and or animals on the same unit of land. And that's the key point. In any piece of land or any farm, we can have crops, we can have grass, and we could have a woodland or a piece of forest. But agroforestry is a different concept. That's where you actually are operating both systems on the same unit of land, and you create then a new system, if you like, because of the significant ecological and economic interactions you get between the tree and the agricultural components. Agroforestry, of course, is a worldwide practice, and there are many variants of the system, from growing pineapples beneath banana trees for shade to all sorts of other interactions you could get. But in this country, because by and large, the issue we're trying to address is on pasture land, we're trying to get trees into pasture land. We use the term silvopasture, trees on pasture, or we could have a silvo-arable system, for example, where we would grow an arable crop between trees, and many combinations in between. It could be a horticultural system, which would involve trees and another crop in an arable context. That's really a matter of definition, which doesn't matter that much, but I'll stick with the term silvopasture, because technically that's what we're talking about for most of today. Most of us know, we think of our basic biology and what we learned about natural systems. We know that the more complex an ecosystem is, or a natural system is, the more stable it is, and the less likely it is to suffer from external influences or to leak nutrients or gases or whatever out of that system. And if we think there of a simple livestock system, where the sheep or cow grazing, it's grazing the grass, it's returning nutrients in dung and urine, and if perhaps nutrients have been added in the form of slurry or manure, the system is fairly open and weak, if you like. If we have added slurry or manure, and then you get heavy rainfall, then a lot of those nutrients can be lost into the water course, and you end up with pollution. If we add, and it's fairly low in levels of biodiversity, because it's a very uniform, it's just a single dimensional landscape, if you like. If we add a tree to that system, we immediately introduce a level of complexity to the whole ecosystem, which delivers a whole range of other benefits to that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see right away you're ending up with what is a more complex system, And that, by definition, is a more stable system. That if any nutrients escape below the layer of soil, the grass soil, then those nutrients can be absorbed by the tree roots, which will be below the grass level, and then the phosphate or your nitrogen can be recycled through the tree or go into the timber and back onto the land. We all know the benefits of trees, for example, in encouraging biodiversity, and we know the benefits of trees for soil health in opening up and aerating the soil and the soil fauna and flora that you get associated with trees. Then we have the direct interaction of the livestock with the trees itself, which bring shelter, which bring shade, which bring browse, and which bring a diversity which many people have tried to equate to a more welfare-friendly system. In other words, animals are facing more of a diverse landscape in the pasture they're grazing. All those benefit, all those that interaction between the livestock and the tree is what makes an agroforestry system deliver the wider range of ecosystem services than just a simple forest would, or a simple livestock system. Just some examples, just before we go on to look at more detail, of agroforestry systems. These are all pictures from Ireland, one way or another. On the top left, you'll see it's our organic beef farm in County Cavan, the Shackletons farm. You'll see me use that example on a few occasions. In the top middle there, we have near Clonakilty, Liam Beechener's farm, where he has planted agroforestry, and he cuts taken a couple of cuts of silage between the trees, and that's another effective way of getting this integration of crop and livestock and animal production. Liam's was the first site in the Republic of Ireland to be established about 12-13 years ago, the first agroforestry trial site, if you like, silvopastoral trial site. And that's his site now 12 years later. That was in 2019. So the trees have done well, and he's still able to manage that as a silvopastoral system. A site near Sligo where young beef cattle or young dairy replacements are being grazed. I think it's amongst mostly hazel and ash trees, or hazel and willow trees, and a site in Wexford where pigs in trees, and orchards as well. A grazed orchard is technically really a silvopasture. Silvo-arable site in County Armagh, where we have a cereal, we grew cereal between rows of poplars very effectively. And the site, our own research site in Loughgall, County Armagh, where we've had sheep grazing under ash trees. And in the early stages of that trial, we did have young dairy heifers operating perfectly well within that system. Even a poultry system, hens are obviously a woodland bird. They like outdoor poultry systems, are very well adapted to agroforestry. The trees absorb the ammonia that the hens produce, and if you have those trees planted even around hen houses, with a significant distance out from the hen house, they will actually absorb a lot of the excess ammonia that's coming off those houses and help deal with that problem. So these are just some examples of what I mean by the concept of integrating both pasture and, if you like, a livestock system. Just to think about the evidence base that we have for what I'm going to talk about, and we've got to say that a lot of the examples of a lot of the research have come from the trial that we established at Loughgall in County Armagh in 1989, 1990, over 30 years ago. And there, the driver really was not carbon, it was not climate change as such. It was really the whole concern about grassland intensification and the lack of trees in our landscape. And we wanted to make grasslands in Northern Ireland more sustainable by increasing the tree cover to improve biodiversity and these other benefits, nutrient capture, water quality, and soil health. So we took, I suppose, we were part of a group, a UK national network experiment, and we set up a site at Loughgall where we had 3 different treatments, just open grassland. Well, we started from a clean sheet, we reseeded the whole area, and we set up a series of plots, some with just pasture alone with perennial ryegrass, then some with ash trees planted to 400 stems per hectare. That's 5 meters spacing in the ryegrass, and then also woodland ash planted at 2,500 stems per hectare. And we had 3 replicates of each of those trees. So in other, we had 9 replicate plots there. That trial was repeated at 6 other sites across the UK. So, and we managed them all under exactly the same protocols. So there's a lot of scientific verification for the results that we found, and that's been one of the great benefits of the trial. Of course, getting funding for research like this is difficult. And as time went on through the 90s and so on, there was difficulty with maintaining the funding for sites. And gradually most of the other 5 sites in UK have fallen by the wayside. And the Loughgall site is still there. It's still, you know, retained its integrity of the plot replication. And I think it's now one of the longest running silvopastoral trials in Europe in over 30 years. So we've got the benefit of a lot of results from it. Just a few shots of sort of the history of how the trees developed on the site over that time. We grazed, when the trees were planted, livestock were put in the day and hour that the trees were planted, basically. So there have been livestock in that system since then. Sheep for the first 6 or 7 years until the trees were big enough to put small cattle in. But you know, we can come to issues like that. I mean, there are other ways that silvopasture can, you can put more effort into tree protection if you need to integrate cattle at an earlier state. And we had to, because we were following a very strict protocol, grazing protocol, we had a set stocking system. In other words, the sheep were put on. We maintained a stock density of about 15 ewes per hectare. They were put on in March with lambs, and they stayed right on till November. So we were able to finish the lambs off on those plots, and we were able then to actually look at the effect of the system on all sorts of properties, from fat levels in meat, from carcass quality, from wool production, from animal behaviour, and we traced those right through. The problem with that was, as the season went on and the animals got more and more familiar with the trees, they integrated more with them. They'd nibble the bark, they would rub them more. And what we recommend now really is a rotational grazing system, where you let the grass grow up, put the animals in, they graze it, or you take a cut maybe of silage, and you then graze the grass down quite quickly and get the animals back out again, and that way you get very little interaction with the tree stock. I'll talk a bit about tree protection later on. So the trees grew well because there'd been very little experience of growing trees in this type of scenario, trees at this wide spacing, in conjunction with reasonably intensively managed grassland, and also with farmer experience of actually operating a grassland-based system in this type of scenario. I think it's true to say nearly all of us who were involved in that early silvopastoral work were agronomists or grassland people. Foresters were fairly nervous, let's say, about the system, because from a forester's point of view, correctly of course, this is not the way to grow tall straight trees. At that type of spacings, you have all sorts of issues with growing trees, whereas we were interested more in creating a sustainable livestock system, a sustainable grassland system with, if you like, trees bolted on to add these added benefits. So we wanted to prove that the system would work, and you could still top the grass, you could put on fertilizer, you could put on slurry, you could do all the sort of normal grassland management practices. And I think we showed that pretty well. So the trees grew. We chose ash for our site. I mean, and we also had replicate plots of sycamore, by the way. Sycamore didn't do well because we believe now we got bad initial stock. It was very hard to get enough trees from exactly the same stock, and they ended up being Central European, I think it was. This is in the late 1980s. So anyway, we quickly just put all our efforts into the ash plots, and of course now we have the fact most of these trees will eventually go. But at least I think we've had 30 years experience, and it's enough to learn the principles and get the basics of taking a silvopastoral system through to maturity. The trees grew well, but by about year 12 or so, we were faced with a decision, because by then we had full grass production right up to year 12. And by about year 13, then the canopy had closed to a level where we were starting to get a decline in sheep production. So we had to make a decision. Would we continue just to let the canopy grow and grass production fall, and therefore sheep production fall? First of all, we were surprised that we went as far as 12 years, and that really proved that grass was a much more tolerant crop of shade, and that sheep were also getting additional benefits from the whole system, which meant that we were able to keep full output for 12 years. And of course, well, this land was considered by the department to be eligible for basic payment, for single farm payment, and therefore the farmer, these trees were growing as an asset, and at the same time the farmer was getting the basic payment on that. So we made a decision by year 13 or so, and 14, grass growth started, sheep production started to go down as the grass growth started to reduce. And we decided then, and at that point, whenever we had groups of farmers visiting the site, this was the one thing that really attracted them, was the flexibility of the system. They said, you know, if we planted our land in forestry or in woodland, that's it tied up for 40, 50 years, 60 years or whatever. Whereas this is a flexible system. Here at year 12 or 13, we can make a decision. We can either look at the market ahead or look at what suits our farm and say, yes, there's going to be a great market for timber and carbon in the future, so let's just let the tree asset grow. Or they can say, no, we want to keep maintaining our livestock output, so we'll thin the trees and keep the balance of the system. And a lot of landowners, a lot of farmers liked that basic decision, the opportunity to make that flexible decision. Also, of course, nowadays that we're in a different scenario, whenever carbon and emission addressing are our big issues, the whole ethos, if you like, of how you would look at the future of silvopasture has changed, and it's become much more important. We decided to thin, and we removed a quarter of the trees. That was about 100 stems per hectare. And because they were ash, and the Guild of Hurley stick makers and so on came and visited them and thought they were tremendous, because they didn't have much experience of ash growing at such wide spacing, and the trees had terrific basal sweep. And we sold that first thinning, and the second subsequent thinning we did a few years later. There were Hurley quality ash butts, and we sold those. So at year 12 then, or year 13, the farmer got an injection of over €1,000 per hectare from that sell off of timber. So that, you know, economically the system was working well, okay, that was ash was an exceptional crop in that, but there's no reason now why you couldn't grow other trees, high quality trees, if you manage them properly and get good value from them. Those of you looking at the pictures of this will probably say these are terribly managed trees, because probably the most people in the audience are foresters, and they'll say, I wouldn't have managed ash like that. And you're probably right, because none of us who approached this were foresters, and we should have concentrated more on, we did do some pruning in the early years, but we should have concentrated more on crown thinning and opening up crowns and so on. But you know, we demonstrated the principles, I think, and the timber, there is valuable timber in there, even at that spacing. So now the trees are down to about 210 or just over 200 trees per hectare after a couple of thinnings. And we might do a further thinning, that the department might decide to do that, to bring the final stand numbers down even further. But the point is, it's still grassland. It's still able to maintain sheep production at about 70% or so of open pasture, of open air, of where there were no trees, if you like. We've about 70% sheep production in there. So, and we also, of course, have a system which we think it has worked from an agronomic point of view and from a farming point of view. But now we feel it's come into its own, because It's now delivering what we call ecosystem services. That is just the benefits that nature brings, if you like, to mankind generally, not just in terms of agricultural production. And if we think of a system like that we have, what are the type of ecosystem service benefits that this silvopasture is bringing? Of course, the first and most important is food and food production. And we have meat and wool that are produced from that at a satisfactory level, and no problems with the animals, with their interaction or the quality of their meat or wool. Then, of course, we have the additional benefits that the silvopasture brings. We've also got the trees and the renewable energy they bring, the wood they have. We've got the opportunity to introduce mixtures of trees and that, which will have more maybe trees that are better pollinators. We have more biodiversity associated with the trees, and we have fodder from the tree leaves, which I'll deal with later. And then below the ground, we have a significant suite of benefits, such as improved carbon storage and more permeable soil, which allows the water to filter through it, which helps prevent flood control. And this is a very important benefit. It also means we can extend the length of the grazing season, because animals can stay on that pasture, as I'll show you later, anything up to 3 to 4 months longer in the year. And that has significant benefits for all sorts of air quality issues and so on. And it means we can get pure water and cleaner water because we're filtering nutrients out of the system. And in terms of scenery, a landscape where there are trees scattered through it, or trees in regular pattern, if that's what you wish, is one that can, it can break up the monotony of large areas of grass or crops or whatever. Fortunately, because this was department trial and we were part of Queen's University as well, we were able to have a raft of students working on these plots over many years, and that enabled us to get a lot of very good scientific information on how the silvopasture developed and how these ecosystem services that were delivered by the silvopasture. For example, if you think, certainly this is, sorry, I've just used the Northern Ireland graphs here that are figures that the ones had at hand, but you have the same problems in the south as well. Huge problems with soil phosphate levels and with ammonia emissions. And these are the red in the middle of mid-Ulster there are all just soils with index P3 and above. These are all problem soils with phosphate through intensive livestock production, and roughly the same map here for the ammonia emissions, which is just reflecting really the intensity of poultry systems and intensity of mainly beef and dairy systems. So these are the sort of areas that we have a problem. And we've shown from the research that I talked about a minute ago that in our silvopastoral systems, we have improved nutrient cycling. We can reduce phosphate. We can mine phosphate from the soil, if you like, into the timber part of the system. We can certainly reduce nutrient leakage, and we've sequestered carbon. All of these I'll show you some evidence for at the minute. And we really have an opportunity for nutrient sustainability, for recycling those nutrients through the system and making a much more closed system because of the way that the trees are interacting with the pasture. In terms of biodiversity, as I said, many generations of students have been able to use these plots to investigate various specialist groups of plants and animals. Just some of the data there. The middle bar of those graphs are the agroforestry plots. These are the grassland plots, and these are just the woodland plots on their own. This is when the trees were about 9 or 10 years old. Those graphs were produced. But we demonstrated significant increases in spiders, birds, beetles, earthworms, and particularly juvenile earthworms, and in flora, ground flora, and particularly also encouraged pollinators. So from a biodiversity, as you would expect, when if you have a straight, pure grass sward and you introduce trees onto that, you're going to end up with significant biodiversity benefits. Then, as I said, when we started, really, carbon was not the big issue. It was not the driver, certainly 30 years ago, from our farmland systems. But we, as the experiment went on, we realized we had a tremendous asset. We knew the history of our plots, the fertilizer that's been added. We knew all the benefits that had been brought to it. So we had an opportunity to look at the number of trees and look at the carbon that was stored in those trees. So we got some, my colleague Rodrigo Olave, who runs the agroforestry program in Northern Ireland now, managed to get some funding to completely harvest, I think it was, we got 8 trees at least, completely harvested, that is, dug out every root and out of the ground and every twig and branch, and we're able to measure the biomass and the carbon content of those. So by the time that the trees were 21 years old, the total carbon in the woody biomass in the silvopasture was about 77 tonnes per hectare. So that had accumulated over 21 years. So you had over 3 tonnes of hectare per year. But of course, that would not be uniform over that time, because it would be a very slow pickup when the trees were small and we were now at a more mature level. But it had accumulated standing carbon stock in the wood anyway at that sort of level. Then we took a good look at the soil, because here we had a great opportunity. We had plots that were we knew the history of, and we'd replicate plots, and we could then look down through the soil profile and see where the carbon was stored in that. When we looked at that, our initial results were disappointing, because we found that really there was very little difference in the amount of carbon stored in the grassland than in the woodland and in the agroforestry. But when my colleagues in the soil science branch in AFBI looked into it in more detail, and they looked at where that carbon was bound on soil particles, they found that carbon that was bound to the very small soil particles, and this is the carbon that's more recalcitrant, in other words, that's more firmly bound into the soil and is less likely to be lost through oxidation and so on. And there was much more of this carbon in this tightly bound form in the woodland here and the agroforestry than in the grassland. So the agroforestry, as you'd expect, was sort of median to grassland, woodland, agroforestry. This is the top 10 centimeters of soil. This is 10 to 20 centimeters of soil. So we were showing that there was a good story in terms of carbon. The carbon was being gradually bound into the grassland in a firm form. And so when you added the carbon stored in the wood, and you looked at the form that the carbon was bound up in the grassland, and we looked at our the carbon that was being continually sequestered in the grassland soil, our estimates from carbon sequestration from the silvopasture were about 2.4 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, well above obviously a grassland sward, and but of course, as you'd expect, below a typical fast-growing forest plantation. But here, at least, as well as storing this carbon, we were delivering a whole range of other farming benefits, outputs, ecosystem services, which have great value. Climate change is, of course, the greatest threat really we face, and more and more thrust into the limelight with our climate bills and so on we're coming. And if we look at how can silvopasture deal with make our farming systems more resilient, if we have some silvopasture on farms. We know from the climate change prediction for Ireland that we're going to face drier, warmer summers and possibly warmer, wetter winters, and particular problems in spring and autumn. But we all remember, I'm sure, that 2018 we had a really severe drought in July and August, and these are the grass growth curves. There's the growth curve for grass in Ireland during 2018. The dotted line is the 10-year average, and in 2018, of course, grass practically stopped, as we know, in July and August. And from that, we faced a huge fodder shortage problem the following winter. Okay, and we had to live through that. Well, people said, oh, well, that's a one-off, that'll never happen again, or that type of scenario. But if you look at the last 2 years, 2019, 2020, here, once again, not the same extreme, of course, as in 2018, but we're still getting this deficit, the soil moisture deficit, which is causing a reduction in grass growth. So we're still nowhere near picking up what our 10-year average growth, previous year growth average was. So these are the type of situations we're going to face, and how can silvopasture perhaps help us deal with some of those. Just in terms of other climate extremes, we know that wide space trees will reduce the wind speed and they reduce evapotranspiration. We have measures for that. And we know that in terms of storminess, if we're going to get more severe storms, a lot of densely planted trees do become more vulnerable, particularly on poor soils. And trees planted at wider spacing can be more wind firm. So we also, in terms of changes in weather patterns, if we have a no grazing scenario, if we have an accumulation of, if you like, fire risk within our forests managed as agroforests, where you introduce grazing to reduce the understory fuel loading, can be a great benefit to preventing wildfires in forests. Just some examples there. And this is just an interest. Some of my experience has been in South America, in Chile, for example, looking where silvopastoral systems were, the idea was sort of taken off about the same time as we started here. By the way, we were sort of following the New Zealand model, where they had planted wide space Pinus radiata to control soil erosion. And I suppose that was the overall, and then grazing between those. That was where we got the idea from, or came from. And also in Chile, where there poplar were being planted mainly for pulp by commercial companies. And then at wide spacing, then between those, the farmers were allowed to continue to manage the land for farming. They cut grass for silage in the establishment near the trees. And then as the trees grew older, they were able to continue to cut and remove fodder for hay. And then as the trees got older still, they were able to put cattle in and graze the understory. So they're producing a commercial crop of timber, and at the same time, people are getting the benefit of fodder and of livestock production. And one of their big drivers was to reduce fire risk. In other words, climate mitigation benefits of silvopasture. What we found from our plots in Loughgall, when we looked at the porosity of the soil, the infiltration potential, if you like, when we got to, I think it was, the trees were about 26-year-old, we knew that we had this asset where we had well-documented tree growth, and we had comparative plots where we could actually look down through the soil profile. And this is a measure right down through, and we get the soil, the agroforestry is the permeability of the soil in the agroforestry, and the permeability in the grass-only soils, which are much more compact. And here we get significantly more permeability, right down to 76 centimeters in the soil. So in other words, if you get more intense bursts of rainfall, that will let that water drain away. That results in the grazing season being able to be extended. We measured over 3 years, 13 to 17 weeks, extension in grazing, and greater levels of grass utilization, reduced ammonia emission. If you can, that means you can keep animals out of houses, because one of our problems, of course, of ammonia is from housed stock producing slurry in tanks, which then gives off ammonia. If you can keep animals outside and grazing grass, then you greatly reduce by over 90% your ammonia production. So silvopasture, if you use it at the right time in the year, that's, I'm not saying every farm in this country will adopt agroforestry everywhere. They won't, of course, but if farms even had a small area of agroforestry at 5, 10%, maybe more, 15% of their land in silvopasture, then they could use that at strategic times, particularly in the autumn, to give them, say, 3 months more grazing in autumn and spring, 3 months more out on pasture. That would have a significant benefit on reducing their ammonia emissions. And it would also reduce the nitrogen dioxide emissions, because drier soils give off less nitrogen dioxide. And the other benefits of improved animal health and so on, and improved biological soil health. So we showed that this is the overwinter curves of the soil moisture under grassland at the top and under agroforestry. And that's how we got the extension to the grazing. Tree leaves can be used as fodder. There's been some work done in England on that. I won't go into this in detail, but where people have been feeding tree fodder to livestock and found very good levels of production, because the fodder is nutritious. If you compare, this is just comparing the macronutrients in a range of trees. You can see lactic phosphate in the basis, and you can see sort of levels of phosphorus you're getting in tree leaves are not that far off from what you're getting in grass and silage and those sorts of levels, and silage and hay. So the tree fodder has a nutritive value, but we need to probably find out a bit more about that. How is that influenced by the soil type and by the forage that's growing below that soil? So in terms of soil health, there's a lot of evidence worldwide for the benefits of agroforestry. The soil physical structure is improved. You get more porous matter. You get certainly better organic matter, carbon and particulate matter. And there's been work done to show that there are more mycorrhizal fungi associated with the tree roots and in the interaction with the grass. And the whole understory component can be managed as a multi-species sward, which will add on to that carbon benefit and to the nutritional value of the fodder that the animals are getting. So really, sort of this silvopasture, to summarize this part of the talk, gives an extended grazing season, increased biodiversity, more carbon sequestration, and better reduced water runoff, and the ability to mine phosphate from soil. How can that then be reduced into livestock systems? Well, some of you may remember just over a year ago on an RTE climate change program, it was Science Week. One of the changes required to fight climate change was used in the second program was an example between beef production from a low input multi-species sward integrated into a silvopastoral system, and from a high input intensive beef farm that was following all the Teagasc best practice advice. And on the organic farm, on the Shackleton's organic farm, which was the low input unit, Jane Shackleton's profit per animal was exactly the same as the high output farm, and it was emitting twice the amount of carbon per hectare. Of course, there were more stock, density was greater on the high output farm, but it showed that just how you could integrate trees into farmland to get achieve a much better carbon balance, at least on part of that farm. And the reason was, of course, well, the type of cattle that were suited to it, the belted Galloways, the sward composition was more diverse, and the presence of the trees, as we had demonstrated from the previous research on silvopasture. So the challenge really for grass-based ruminant agriculture is to recognize that farms can sequester greenhouse gases as well as emit them, and it's getting that balance, that trying to move towards a net zero carbon livestock system is a challenge. And Devonish Nutrition at their research farm at Dowth are moving down that pathway through, for example, looking at how to sequester more carbon from a mixed farm scenario. And we won't go into all the options. For example, improving the soil pH makes more carbon be absorbed in soil. But one of the methods they're using is to incorporate more agroforestry into their grazing platform, and that's being done at the minute at Dowth to look at moving, and their calculation is that they will be able to move towards a net zero carbon live cattle or system in due course through that. In terms of establishing agroforestry, we can do that either by respacing an existing forest or woodland. In other words, in the top left, there's a larch plantation that was thinned, oversown with grass seed trampled in by sheep, and you had a sward established. Or by planting directly into grassland, and here, where you're just starting with a grass field, planting trees. Tree protection is then the issue. In Northern, there are two agroforestry schemes, support measures on the go. In the north, the scheme is a farming measure. It's under the Rural Development Programme, and this is the specification that is required in that system for protecting the trees as they're planted here, using a white mesh and a good post and a peg or another post to stop the being rotated. And in the south, there's an agroforestry measure, which is under a forestry scheme, and that's one of the recommended variants of tree protection that's used in that system. There are other ways, and there probably could be more innovation and development. I forget where I saw this tree protection, but it was quite an innovative way of using up scraps of timber to protect trees. And for cattle or deer systems, this cactus wire, in other words, sort of pointed barbs, there are various ways out there that you can protect the trees to get them up to a stage where they will be resilient to animals. The secret really is to, of course, plant a mixture of species of tree to suit the site, to deliver a range of environmental benefits and give that resilience. And also to plant the configuration to suit your farming system. Most farmers like to put things in rows because they want to drive up and down and apply something. And there's no need to have those rows very narrow. I mean, if you want to cut silage, you can widen the rows out so that you have shorter distance between trees in rows and more width between rows. And there are many combinations between if you like, growing crops in a tillage system with trees between them, through horticulture in silvopasture and agroforestry, the silvopasture itself. And also the importance of the forage, the value of the forage, actually, and there's a lot of good research that shows that animals that eat twigs and the leaves and trees gives them reduced methane emissions, which, in the climate change scenario. So trees can be introduced to farms in a range of scenarios. Silvopasture we've talked about, here some options, here 24 mana one. And we can't forget hedges too. Most of our hardwood trees are in hedges, and hedges contain a lot of stored carbon and they sequester a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. But we need to quantify that, and farmers, to get a true value of carbon stored in their farm, really the hedge at the minute is not being built into that calculation, which it should be, because that hedge is sequestering as well as actually storing carbon in the ground. And just some examples of landscapes where trees where trees are just, we tend to overlook the amount of carbon that's stored in that picture by the animals, by the trees, and by the grassland itself. And it's getting a metric for that is really, to do the research to get an accurate metric for that is really the challenge which livestock farming, I think, needs to address, so that we can get a truer picture of how we can integrate trees into that system. That's our Loughgall agroforestry site in the background. Still, you have a mixture of trees there. It improves the scenery, improves the landscape, and the livestock will be integrated with those. Many of our iconic landscapes depend on the interaction of livestock and trees. For example, in the Burren Life project, where cattle are actively grazed on these important grasslands in the Burren, and it's the cattle which are preventing scrub invasion of the native biodiverse pastures, and are an integral role into what is really an extremely important worldwide habitat. Just to finish off with, thinking about the barriers of uptake to the system, as I said, really we probably use to livestock systems that are conventional, where we have grass and we have stock associated with that. And if we introduce trees, we're introducing a more complex management. Of course we are. We're reducing the area of land available to the animals, but we're also, at the same time, we must also try and offset those against the benefits that those trees are giving in terms of the options they give us to produce more food from the trees. So I think we can promote silvopasture on farms with a two-pronged attack. One, as a tree production system, because I think it is an option for foresters that people want to grow trees. You can use high value trees. Those can be of great value to both the farming and the forestry industry. And it can be used as a grassland system to produce wholesome food, nutritious food, where farms can be made more sustainable and carbon friendly by incorporating trees at a range of levels. And that's really, those two systems are supported in different ways on this island. In the north, agroforestry support is under a farming measure under the Rural Development Programme, if you like, as our environmental farming scheme. There's an establishment payment and then annual premium, unfortunately only for 5 years. In the south, it's more of a forestry measure. It's much more lucrative. As you can see, there are problems there associated with that, which make it unsuitable for some people, for some farmers in particular. So both these support measures are, while they're appreciated, they are imperfect. And it's very difficult to provide an agroforestry support measure under the conventional route. It's really going to require some innovative thinking to come up with a novel support measure, one that's specifically tailored for an agroforestry. And I think it'll have to be available both within the farming scenario and within the forestry scenario. And we need to put our minds to developing that. The one thing we need is innovation. We need people coming forward with ideas and new ways to use that. And here's a few examples. And I'll just pay tribute to my colleague Eugene Curran in Daphne, who is a huge supporter of the development of agroforestry and silvopasture in the south. And through his work, a lot of that innovation is coming forward and being brought to light. And I'm very extremely grateful for that. For example, some growing elm trees with Shropshire sheep. And we look there, a farm near Roscarbury, the Wiltshires, who have an open air pig unit. They've planted here an area in agroforestry, and they've got a diverse use of trees on their farm. And then they plan that this is the agroforestry they've established, and they plan eventually to move their open air pig unit into that. That's the sort of innovative system that we want to come forward. Poultry systems are well adapted to silvopasture. As I said, hens are ideally suited to trees in grassland and all the benefits that bring. And then we talked a bit about Liam Beechener's trial in Clonakilty. It's a good example. Unfortunately, ash once again, but still the value of it, it's demonstrated the principle that you can grow trees at this wide spacing and cut silage between those trees. The interesting, a huge row of dairy cows moving over the background there. Finally, really, there is a huge opportunity here to improve the quality of the trees that we use in silvopasture. There are a lot of seed improvement programs going on in Ireland. There are a lot of silvicultural advances, and we have a lot of historic forest stands of species there, which offer us the chance to look much more at tree form and how trees produced at wide spacing in silvopasture. Trees are valuable, and they can be valuable. And the trees you plant and you manage right from the start can be a valuable asset. And there's a lot of opportunity there to look at the variety and the genetic diversity in trees to do that. And in the north as well, we're involved with, or throughout the island, we're involved with Future Trees Trust, who are just one group who are looking at improving broadleaf trees in the UK and Ireland by conventional selective breeding. For example, here's a clonal sycamore seed orchard in Ireland, and in Loughgall we're looking at, we have fortunately have some good selections of cherry varieties, which would be one of the trees we hope to follow on with some of our ash plantations, maybe sea cherry and our beech and oak as future generation trees for silvopasture. So we need to do that R&D and to support that. So agroforestry, to summarise really, agroforestry can be part of a farm support measure and the forestry support measure. It fits well with eco schemes and carbon farming schemes. It gives increased climate resilience. It lends itself well to an organic system. It can sequester carbon rates, which often approach those of equivalent forestry. And it can give support for grazing and forest land for fire control. But importantly, these are all very climate positive, carbon positive benefits. There is a need out there for, we're already detecting a need for knowledge and information, and a need for, if you like, a forum that can act as a coordinated voice, because agroforestry is still a very dispersed interest, that can educate people, that can help disseminate the research that's been done to train people and give advice to policy and promote agroforestry, and also to reap the benefits of the European Agroforestry Forum, which Ireland is a member of. So we've formed a group called the Irish Agroforestry Forum, and it has got those specific aims, and that's its new logo, and hopefully you're going to see more of that in the future. In fact, we're having our first conference on the 12th and 13th of April, and you can go online and Irish Agroforestry Conference, and that's really bringing together where we stand with agroforestry, and it's taking it forward, if you like. Just to finish off, whenever we started doing these agroforestry trials in the north, there was a degree of skepticism too, as you'd expect. Not everyone saw it in the same enthusiastic light as we did. And in our local farm paper, Farm Week, the Willie John was every week had a cartoon in it, and the one in April 1996, he must have visited our agroforestry in Loughgall and said that the poor old dog was going to have to throw his leg up at every tree and he wouldn't be fit to gather sheep. But so that's the way we need to try and convince people. And even though, and really our challenge going ahead is we need to just try and promote silvopasture or agroforestry and its wider benefits. And just as a joke there, though everyone might want to hear the advantage, perhaps that poor chap was just suffering from the sun when he was, or listening to me was too much for him. Thank you very much indeed. These cows are keeping forestry personnel out only, but surely the future ahead is for all of us to work together to try and look for land use systems which will address some of these significant challenges which are facing farmers, and look at the range of options available to provide solutions. Thank you very much indeed.